Tonight, as you settle into the quiet embrace of your evening, let your thoughts drift slowly and gently into the past. Imagine yourself far away from the softness of your bed and the gentle glow of electric light, carried instead through time to a place where shadows stretched long over cobbled streets, and where the concept of justice was more a question of spectacle than fairness. You are stepping into the winding alleys of medieval Europe where the smell of hearth fires mingles with that of horses and damp straw, where church bells toll the hour with solemn weight, and where crime, even petty theft, is not merely a misstep, but an invitation to punishment that is both public and profound. Being a thief in this world wasn't just a matter of cunning or desperation. It was often a matter of survival, and the cost could be steep. But before you rush to the gallows in your imagination, pause. Let's walk through this world first. Let the world of the medieval thief unfold slowly around you. Who they were, what they stole, how society viewed them, and most curiously of all, how the line between necessity and crime was often drawn by hunger, power, or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. So allow yourself to relax, breathe deeply, and begin the slow journey through muddy streets and crumbling city gates, through courtrooms and prisons, through cathedrals and taverns alike. Let us begin with the world in which the medieval thief lived. The medieval city is not one place, but 100 overlapping spaces, each with its own rhythms, rules, and risks. You find yourself walking slowly down a narrow lane, its walls close enough that even the faintest sound, a whisper, a footstep, a breath chose between the stones. Above, second stories lean toward each other, wooden beams straining like arms reaching across the divide. Laundry flaps lazily on thin ropes, and the air is thick with the scent of old firewood, human sweat, and something sharp, perhaps vinegar, or ale gone sour. It is in this city, or one like it, that a thief would make their way through the day, or more often, through the night. For theft in the Middle Ages was not the work of a sleek, masked figure cloaked in romance, but typically a desperate act by someone pushed to the margins of society. The poor stole bread, or meat, or shoes. Children stole fabric scraps or candles. And sometimes, people simply stole because the alternative was to freeze, to starve, or to fail someone they loved. But it is not just hunger that breeds crime. The medieval marketplace, chaotic, colourful, and endlessly noisy, was both a livelihood and a temptation. Wooden stalls leaned under the weight of goods. Fresh vegetables, smoked fish, small pottery, bundles of wool. Coins clinked, hands moved quickly, and a moment of distraction a merchant turned toward a loud customer. A child, crying in a crowd, could become an opportunity. Still, to be caught stealing even the smallest item could mean humiliation, or worse. Towns often employed watchmen, poorly paid, easily bribed, but nonetheless eager to prove their usefulness. They patrolled markets and gates, wearing rough cloaks and carrying wooden clubs. If they caught a thief, they didn't arrest with ceremony. There were no police stations, no holding cells as we know them. There was a beating, or perhaps the crowd itself would seize the criminal, dragging them to the town square. In larger cities like London or Paris, neighbourhoods became known for their danger places where honest citizens didn't linger. These quarters were home to beggars, travellers without permits, former soldiers, prostitutes, and yes, thieves. But even among the so-called criminals, there were invisible hierarchies. Pickpockets, for instance, had their own codes and even rudimentary guilds. They passed on techniques, often in taverns where strong ale dulled the sense of danger. And yet, unlike the modern world, where petty crime might mean a ticket or a court date, the medieval response to theft was often theatrical and physical. A first offence might see you paraded through the town, with a placard declaring your crime. A second offence could mean the pillory your head and hands locked in wood, vulnerable to insults, vegetables, or worse from passers-by. And if you dared to steal from the church or from a noble, the punishments grew darker still. So the thief walked a fine line. By day they might appear to be a washerwoman's helper or a candle boy. By night, they might creep along rooftops or melt into the shadows near a merchant's home. Some survived for years. Others vanished, quickly caught, broken, forgotten. And all the while, ordinary people lived around them. Bakers who boarded up their stalls after hours. Priests who preached against sin but quietly paid someone to recover a stolen chalice. Mothers who told their children that to lie, to take what was not theirs, was to risk God's wrath and public shame. You pause in your nighttime journey through these cobbled streets and listen to the low murmur of a nearby tavern. You imagine the thief, a thin figure in a patched cloak, slipping in among the crowd, hoping for warmth and watching pockets. They are not glamorous. They are tired, wary, and terribly alone. The medieval world did not forgive easily, and it rarely forgot. But still, people stole, and as the sun rises on another day, carts creak down muddy lanes, and another small theft goes unnoticed. For now, let us now turn from the alleys and marketplaces to the individuals themselves, the faces behind the crimes, the stories behind the names. As you continue wandering through the still, cool hush of medieval streets, your thoughts drift toward the people themselves, the men, women, and children whose names have mostly been lost to time, but whose lives brushed up against the harsh reality of medieval justice. Each had a reason, a story, a path that brought them from the simple act of living to the desperate act of taking. Imagine one of them now, a boy no older than 13, wearing a rough tunic that barely reaches his knees. His shoes are patched with bits of cloth, and his hands are raw from gathering firewood. He was born into poverty in the shadows of a monastery, where his mother scrubbed floors, and his father long gone might have been a soldier or a drunk, or just one more body in a plague pit. One morning, hungry and cold, he reaches for an apple from a market cart. He does not run fast enough. Then, picture a woman, perhaps in her late 30s, though time and toil have carved more years into her face than the calendar admits. She once had a husband, a home, a place in the village, but war or illness or debt took it all. Now she lives on the edge of the town's charity, stitching linen in exchange for crusts and sometimes less. One evening she tucks a spool of thread into her sleeve. It is small, barely worth a coin, but someone saw her. Not all thieves were desperate. Some were calculated, even skilled. In port cities, where sailors mingled with traders and strangers passed through each day, there were professional pickpockets who could relieve a merchant of his coin purse without so much as brushing his cloak. There were locksmiths who fashioned false keys, apprentices who listened to their masters' secrets, and even clergymen who siphoned funds from the alms box. There are records, though fragmented, of certain thieves who became infamous in their time. In 13th century England, a man named William the Cutpurse was caught stealing from pilgrims near Canterbury. Chroniclers noted not just his crimes, but the speed with which he performed his sleight of hand compared, in a grudging tone, to that of an entertainer. He was hanged, but his story lived on in taverns and cautionary sermons for decades. Likewise, in France, court rolls describe a woman known only as Margot la Rousse, Margot the Redhead, accused of stealing silk and coin from visiting merchants. Whether she did so alone or as part of a ring we cannot say, but her punishment was exile, branded on the shoulder, sent to walk the roads with nothing but a scrap of parchment proclaiming her guilt. Some thieves did not act alone. Bands of highwaymen roamed the countryside, preying on travellers and messengers. They were often former soldiers, disbanded and unpaid, who turned to robbery when peace left them with empty hands and sharpened blades. In the forests near cities, they would wait silent, patient until a rider approached, and then they would vanish again into the trees. These were the ones most feared. Yet the line between outlaw and folk hero was sometimes thin. In the Germanic lands, stories told of clever thieves who stole from nobles and shared with the poor, whether in fact or legend. Much later, the figure of Robin Hood would become the romantic embodiment of this idea, but in the real Middle Ages, Few outlaws lived long enough to earn a ballad. The courts, when they did function, were not kind to thieves. There was no public defender, no presumption of innocence. If you were poor, you stood alone. The bailiff, the priest, the lord's reeve would hear the case, often after a confession extracted by fear or force. Then the sentence came, swift, final, public. Sometimes you were lucky. A sympathetic priest might argue for mercy, or a wealthy townsperson might pay your fine in exchange for labor. But more often, luck ran dry. Even children as young as 7 could be punished as adults if they were thought to understand their actions. A 10-year-old boy might be whipped, paraded through the town, or locked in a cage. Girls fared no better, and were often shamed in addition to punished, their virtue and future marriage prospects lost with a single theft. So many faces, so many names mostly forgotten, except in brittle scrolls and musty ledgers, but each one was real. They walked the same streets you imagine now. They saw the same moon, rising pale and heavy over rooftops. They heard the same church bells that now mark the passing of another hour. You pause, gently. You imagine them not as criminals, but as people tired, frightened, complicated, some repentant, others hardened, all marked by a world that did not often forgive. And so, with that thought, you begin to wonder, where were these people kept once caught? What did punishment truly mean, not in theory, but in practice? Let us now step into the cold, damp world of medieval punishment and imprisonment, the next chapter in the thief's journey. You step slowly into the next layer of this world, descending into places where light barely reaches and the air turns close and sour. The medieval prison is not the institution you might imagine today. It is not a space for reform, not a mechanism of slow rehabilitation. It is a holding, place-cold, temporary, and cruel. A thief who found themselves here had already lost most of their freedom, and quite possibly their future. Prisons in the medieval period were often little more than stone rooms beneath castles, town halls, or churches. The walls dripped with moisture. The floors, if not packed earth, were rough stone, and straw was scattered in heaps that might once have offered some comfort, now merely rotting in place. The air held a damp stillness, thick with the scent of mildew, unwashed bodies, and sometimes blood. Light filtered in weakly through small slits high in the wall, if at all. You might picture a lone figure curled against the wall, their ankles chained, listening to the faraway sound of a market above or the clink of armor from a guard passing by. Some cells held multiple people, men and women, guilty and accused alike, pressed together by circumstance. Fights could break out, so could bonds of quiet camaraderie. But mostly, the days passed in silence, punctuated only by the arrival of stale bread or the scrape of a bucket. Punishment for theft depended not just on the crime itself, but on the time, place, and who had been stolen from. Stealing from the church, for instance, brought swift and brutal response. A loaf of bread taken from a fellow villager might earn scorn or leniency, but take from the tithe barn or monastery, and divine justice would be demanded, often interpreted through pain. One of the more common penalties for thieves was public shaming. You can imagine it now, a wooden platform in the center of the town square, surrounded by a murmuring crowd. The thief, forced into the stocks or pillory, could be left for hours or days. The stocks held the ankles fast, while the pillory bound the neck and wrists, rendering the body immobile and exposed. And there was more than discomfort involved. Townspeople were encouraged to throw things, rotten food, dung, mud. Some jeered, others spat. The point was not merely to punish, but to warn, to make an example. And for some, especially those falsely accused or caught stealing for the first time, it was a humiliation they never truly escaped. But some punishments were permanent. Branding, for instance, was not uncommon. A hot iron might be pressed against the cheek or hand, marking the criminal with a letter T for thief in some places, or a symbol tied to their act. This served as both punishment and a lifelong badge of mistrust. In England, the concept of benefit of clergy allowed some literate menthos who could read a particular Latin frasetto avoid harsher punishments by being tried under ecclesiastical law. But this benefit rarely extended to women, the poor, or the illiterate. The thief who could not read often faced the harshest fate. In the countryside, where local lords held sway, justice was dispensed more personally. A thief caught on a noble's estate might be hanged on the spot, without trial. The gallows stood as a permanent fixture near many towns, a grim silhouette against the sky, reminding all who passed what lay in wait for those who defied the law. There were other methods, too less final, but no less cruel. Some thieves had their ears cropped or their noses slit. Others were flogged, marched through the streets with their wounds still bleeding. The intention was clear. Crime would not only be punished, it would be remembered. But not all responses were brutal. In some cities, magistrates issued fines instead. A wealthy merchant's son caught stealing might be required to pay restitution and perform penance at a church altar. In places influenced by Roman legal traditions, such as parts of southern France or Italy, there was more emphasis on monetary compensation. Still, for the majority the poor, the nameless, the easily discarded, the path from theft to punishment was short, harsh, and irreversible. The justice system had no cushion. Mercy was rare, and even when granted, it did little to restore a life already marred by poverty and shame. You pause now, imagining the feel of those stones beneath your feet, the echo of distant footsteps, the flicker of torchlight as a guard approaches. These prisons, these punishments, were not designed to rehabilitate. They were designed to remind, to make others think twice. But what of the places they came from? The homes, the lives, the bleak conditions that drove so many to steal in the first place. Perhaps it is time to step back from the dungeons and look more closely at the society itself, the vast gap between the rich and poor, and how deeply it shaped the very meaning of crime. Step back with me now from the narrow stone cells and the creaking of gallows ropes. Let the noise of jeering crowds fade into the distance, and instead picture the quiet stillness of a cold morning in a peasant village, mist curling low over frost-tipped fields. The thatched roofs are rimmed with dew. A chimney coughs smoke into the air. A woman huddles near the hearth, coaxing a meagre fire to life with damp twigs. There is no breakfast, only a cracked pot of boiled oats that barely fills 2 wooden bowls. It is in this world, in this daily scarcity, that many of the medieval thieves were shaped. For in truth, theft in the Middle Ages was as often about survival as it was about greed. The divide between those who had and those who did not was not just wide, was enforced, systemically and spiritually, as the natural order of things. At the top of the social pyramid were the nobles, lords, knights, and landed gentry who owned vast swaths of countryside. They collected rents, controlled the forests, and held legal rights over the people who lived on their land. Beneath them were the clergy, whose power came not only from divine authority, but from the land and wealth they too controlled. Then came the merchants and guildsmen, of whom amassed considerable fortunes in towns and cities. At the bottom were the peasants, labourers, servants, and the truly landless poor. Many lived at the mercy of weather, harvest, and taxation. A failed crop, a sick cow, or an early frost could mean hunger by winter, and hunger turned quickly to desperation. The forest, for instance, was often a forbidden place. Though it teemed with life deer, rabbits, birdsit was considered the property of the local lord or the crown. Poaching, even just gathering firewood, could be treated as theft. A man who laid a snare or picked up a fallen branch could find himself in shackles. And yet, with no fuel and no food, many risked it. In towns, the opportunities were different, but the desperation no less real. Apprentices under abusive masters sometimes ran away, turning to petty crime to survive. Widows without male relatives or support became beggars, or worse, objects of suspicion if they were caught asking for food too often. Children were sent to the streets to sell small wares, but if those wares were lost or stolen, they might themselves be accused. Charity existed, but it was limited and deeply moralized. A poor person seen as pious and humble might receive a crust from a monastery or a warm place near the kitchen, but those labelled idle, drunk, or disorderly, however unfairly, were cast aside. And as towns grew more crowded, suspicions between neighbours grew stronger. Theft, whether real or imagined, became a way to explain away loss or misfortune. The law was rarely in favour of the poor. Legal codes were often written by and for the landholding classes. To steal a sheep from a noble's flock might carry a far greater sentence than stealing a cloak from another peasant, not because the act was worse, but because the owner held more power. The penalties, too, varied not only by region but by class. A noble caught in fraud or embezzlement might pay a fine. A peasant caught with a stolen loaf might be whipped in the square. And then there were taxes sendless, burdensome, and often collected by force. The manorial dues, the church tithe, royal levies, tolls, and market fees. For many, these meant the constant risk of falling into debt, and debt, too, was a kind of crime. Those who could not pay were sometimes imprisoned or forced into indentured labour. In that way, theft and poverty were linked in a cruel cycle. Imagine, now, walking through the outskirts of a town just after sunset. You pass a hovel where a father sits in silence beside an empty pot. His daughter stares at the floor, clutching a thin blanket. There is nothing left to sell, nothing left to trade. And so, he rises and makes his way toward the town square, not to beg, but to take something: a candle, a scrap of cloth, anything. Society condemned him, but rarely did it question why he had come to this point. The church preached against theft, but also against pride, greed, and the hoarding of wealth. Still, the wealthy built stone halls, walled gardens, and locked chests, while the poor gathered crumbs. Occasionally, uprisings broke out. A group of peasants might band together to protest rent increases or demand better conditions, but these were crushed quickly, often with brutal force. The message was clear: order must be preserved, property must be protected, even if that property outweighed a man's life. Yet despite all this, acts of quiet compassion did exist. A miller who turned a blind eye to an extra sack, a baker who left a heel of bread near the church gate, a merchant who pretended not to notice a coin go missing. These acts did not undo the structure, but they softened the edges for a moment. Now, with this fuller view, the figure of the medieval thief grows more complex. Not merely a criminal, but a product of a harsh world. Not simply immoral, but often invisible to those with power. As the wind rustles gently through the trees outside the walls, your thoughts turn to another world just beyond this one, a different circle of society entirely. Not the poor, but the powerful. Not those who stole out of need, but those whose wealth and influence let them bend the rules without ever fearing the stocks. Let us now explore the other side of medieval justice, the nobility, the church, and the curious way theft could be both a sin and a privilege, depending on who committed it. Now let your thoughts rise slowly from the muddy lanes of peasant villages and the worn stones of town squares. Rise beyond the smell of wood smoke and the scrape of hunger. Climb through ivy-covered walls, past iron gates and finely carved doors, into the stone halls of the elite where the world looks very different. Here, within manors, castles and cloisters, theft did not always wear the same name. When it occurred, it was cloaked in terms like levy, entitlement, or collection. Sting, you find yourself standing beneath a vaulted ceiling. Tapestries hang heavy with scenes of saints and warriors, and a fire crackles gently in a hearth the size of a stable. The lord of this estate sits in a carved chair, cloaked in fur, a silver goblet in his hand. Around him are stewards, scribes, and retainers. He does not need to steal bread. He does not need to steal anything because the system delivers wealth to his door, whether he earns it or not. In medieval society, theft was a concept unevenly applied. For the commoner, taking a loaf or a chicken could be met with lashings or worse. But for those of higher station, the lines were blurry. Nobles could raise taxes at will, seize land from tenants, or withhold payment for services rendered. They could appropriate goods during wartime or demand gifts that were never returned. And they could do so without fear of punishment. There are records, for instance, of noblemen appropriating supplies from nearby towns during times of feast or ceremony. Entire barrels of ale, herds of livestock, and wagons of grain could be claimed in the name of hosting royalty or maintaining honor. For the villagers who lost these goods, there was little to do but endure. The church, too, occupied a curious place. As one of the wealthiest institutions in medieval Europe, it held vast tracts of land and collected tithes from nearly every family, rich or poor. These tithes, often a tenth of one's income or produce, were enforced with both religious and legal pressure. If a peasant failed to deliver, he might be barred from communion or worse, taken to court. And yet, corruption within the church was not uncommon. Some clerics siphoned funds meant for charity. Others engaged in simonith selling of church offices or sacraments. Bishops and abbots lived in comfort, while the poor knelt at their gates. But when accusations of theft were brought against the clergy, they were often shielded by ecclesiastical immunity. Trials, if they occurred at all, were slow and lenient. It wasn't just individuals who stole with impunity, it was institutions. Royal treasuries routinely borrowed from merchants and never repaid. Town councils imposed fines on dubious grounds. Lords invented fees for using bridges, roads, or mills they didn't maintain. And entire wars were waged on the pretext of reclaiming lands or punishing treachery, when in truth they were attempts to seize wealth and territory. Still, society rarely named these acts as theft. They were framed as justice, duty, or divine right. When a nobleman took grain from a tenant, it was rent. When a soldier looted a village on campaign, it was spoils. When a king confiscated an estate, it was forfeiture. And so the language of power protected the powerful. You pause here in your reflection, considering how deeply this double standard was woven into medieval life. The moral teachings of the church preached humility, honesty, and the sinfulness of greed. Yet many of those at the pulpit lived in gilded chambers, surrounded by silver plate and velvet vestments. To question this order was dangerous. Those who did radical preachers, reformers, or rebel soften met grim ends. But among the common people, the injustice was felt, spoken of in whispers, and passed down in tales and complaints. Ballads hinted at corrupt bailiffs and greedy bishops. Proverbs warned that the rich man steals with a pen, the poor man hangs for a coin. Even the legal codes betrayed a preference for wealth. Fines were scaled to income, but only when judges chose to enforce it. A wealthy man could pay his way out of punishment, a poor one could not. In some towns, the punishment for theft was not hanging but a fine provided one could pay it, and thus, money became a shield. Yet not all the elite were blind to this imbalance. Some lords enacted reforms on their lands, setting fairer rents or establishing granaries for the poor. Certain monks refused wealth, living in simplicity and advocating for justice. But these were exceptions, and the larger system remained unbending. Now, as the candle burns low and your mind drifts toward quieter thoughts, you might wonder, what of those thieves who found a way to rise above it all? Were there any who turned their misfortune into legend, or who slipped through the cracks of justice and became something more than criminal? It is time, now, to explore the stories that blurred the line between outlaw and icon, to meet the shadowy figures who haunted the edges of society, not reviled, but remembered. As the medieval world turns softly under the stars, we shift our gaze from the chambers of the powerful to the margins of the map where stories grew like wildflowers in the cracks of official history. These were the spaces where the thief became something else entirely. Not merely a criminal, but an outlaw. Not simply condemned, but remembered. Here, along the borders of woods and hills, in lonely valleys and half-forgotten roads, whispers moved from mouth to mouth about those who defied authority and lived beyond its reach. They were feared, yes, but sometimes admired, sometimes even loved. Imagine a campfire deep in Sherwood Forester, in any of the hundreds of forests like it across Europe. Men sit around the flames, cloaked in wool and silence, sharpening blades or counting stolen coin. They are not rich, but neither are they starving. They are hunted, but for now, they are free. Their names may never reach the written page, but their legends grow in every telling. In the English-speaking world, no figure looms larger in this space than Robin Hood. While the historical truth of his existence remains uncertain, the idea of Robin the noble outlaw, who steals from the rich and gives to the poor, was already forming in ballads by the 14th century. He was perhaps a reaction to the harshness of authority, a fantasy of justice in a world where justice rarely favoured the weak. But Robin Hood was not alone. Across medieval Europe, similar tales took root. In Germany, there were stories of Schinderhannes, a later figure who nevertheless inherited the same mythic role. In France, whispers of outlaw knights and peasant rebels flickered from region to region. In Spain and Italy, some bandits were viewed not as villains, but as protectors of their own people against corrupt officials. What all these figures shared was a blurring of morality. They stole, yes, but they did not steal randomly. They challenged those who abused power. They gave alms to the needy. They shared spoils with their followers. Whether these acts were real or only remembered that way doesn't matter so much. What matters is the need these stories fulfilled. Even among real outlaws, there were those who inspired strange loyalty. A thief who robbed only tax collectors might find shelter in a village. A bandit who spared the poor might be warned of patrols by sympathetic farmers. These relationships were fragile, but they existed. People did not trust the law to be fair, and so they sometimes trusted the lawless to be merciful. Still, to live as an outlaw was no easy path. These were not glamorous lives, despite what the tales suggest. Food was hard to come by. Shelter was always temporary. Injury, illness, betrayal all came quickly, and with little help to follow. The forest was not merely romantic. It was damp, cold, and filled with biting insects. Outlaws relied on coded paths, hidden trails, and allies within town innkeepers who looked the other way, merchants who quietly traded goods without questions. But the risk was constant. A single informer could end it all, and bounties offered by lords or townships made betrayal tempting. In many cases, outlaw bands formed from the ruins of war. After campaigns ended, many soldiers were left with no wages, no land, and no purpose. Their skill-stacking, fighting, raiding had no peaceful use, and so they took to the roads, forming roving groups that attacked caravans or raided estates. These were not heroes, but they were part of the same pattern. Those who, once cast aside, turned against the system that discarded them. There were also social rebel peasant leaders who gathered followers in protest against taxes, lords, or corrupt officials. These figures often combined theft with political defiance. In England, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 saw mobs tear through manorial records, burn tax rolls, and demand justice from the king. While not thieves in the common sense, these rebels were branded as such by the powers they challenged. Over time, many of these outlaws faded into silence. Some were captured and executed. Others disappeared into exile or obscurity. But the memory of them remained. Their stories were told in low voices over ale, or sung by wandering minstrels in smoky halls. They became symbols not just of defiance, but of possibility. The idea that someone could beat the system, even briefly, carried weight in a world where power seemed so immovable. And so, the thief's identity split in two. One side, the criminal to be punished. The other, the rogue to be admired. The same act taking what was not given could be seen as evil or heroic, depending on where you stood and who you stole from. As you reflect on these shadowy figures, real or imagined, you begin to understand something more subtle about the world they came from. It was not just the act of stealing that shaped them. It was the structure of society, the rigidity of law, and the quiet hope for something better. But not all tales of crime in the Middle Ages are bound up in rebellion or desperation. Some are stranger, buried deep in records and folklore, where the line between truth and tale becomes wonderfully unclear. Let us now drift gently into the realm of mystery and curiosity, strange crimes, unusual punishments, and the odd corners of medieval justice that still raise questions to this day. Let your thoughts now drift into the stranger folds of medieval life, where the ordinary rules bend and curious stories emerge, like moss-covered stones in a forgotten glade. Here, tucked into dusty court records and the margins of illuminated manuscripts, lie the tales that defy easy explanation, where crime takes on unexpected forms, and punishment becomes a ritual, a warning, or even a bit of theatre. You begin with the theft of silence. In some towns, disturbing the peace during church service, talking, laughing, or even snoring was treated as a punishable offence. A man might be fined for making noise during a sermon, or sentenced to stand barefoot in the town square holding a sign proclaiming his lack of piety. In certain monastic orders, the offence of stealing time by arriving late to prayers was noted in ledgers, with the same solemnity as petty theft. Elsewhere, there were records of animals being put on trial. Yes, actual animals. In parts of France and the Holy Roman Empire, pigs, goats, and even insects were brought before local courts when accused of causing harm. A pig that attacked a child might be formally charged with murder, given a symbolic trial, and even sentenced to death. Sometimes, lawyers were appointed to speak on the animal's behalf. These rituals were less about justice and more about reinforcing social order and human authority, yet they show how seriously the medieval world took the concept of transgression. There are tales of criminals punished not for what they did, but for what they wore. Sumptuary laws in various kingdoms forbade the lower classes from wearing certain fabrics, colours, or jewellery. A butcher's wife caught wearing velvet might be fined or shamed in public. A servant dressed above his station could be accused of deception, or even theft by implication. The crime was not about taking a thing, but about taking a status. In other cases, crimes were strangely symbolic. A woman in a northern town was once punished not for stealing bread, but for impersonating a midwife, a role that held both social trust and spiritual weight. Her sentence involved standing at the church door during Mass, holding a basin of cold water as a reminder of her false claim. Then there were punishments that blurred the line between justice and spectacle. In some Italian cities, thieves were marched through the streets wearing masks, shaped like the animals they were likened, tow foxes, jackals, or wolves. The message was clear, but the pageantry was unforgettable. A man who stole from the marketplace might be forced to wear a cage of live birds on his head, pecking and fluttering with every step. In certain parts of England and Scandinavia, trial by ordeal persisted long after rational judgment began to take root. A suspected thief might be forced to retrieve a stone from boiling water, their innocence proven only if the wound healed cleanly. Others were bound and thrown into a river floating, paradoxically, was taken as a sign of guilt. One particularly strange custom was the charivari, a noisy, mocking procession sometimes directed at thieves, adulterers, or anyone who broke community norms. Pots and pans were banged together, grotesque masks worn, and mocking songs chanted. The accused might be paraded on a donkey, seated backward, or tied to a cart. While not an official punishment, these rituals served as powerful forms of public shaming. In some cases, crimes were committed not by the poor, but by clergymen or nobles acting outside the law, and local communities responded in their own quiet ways. One record tells of a monk who repeatedly stole from the tithe barn and was never punished by the abbey. One morning, he woke to find his cell filled with brambles and nettles. No one claimed responsibility. Nothing was spoken, but the thefts stopped. The very definitions of crime could vary wildly between regions and over time. In one town, taking a neighbor's firewood without asking might be seen as a minor offense. In another, it could carry the same weight as stealing livestock. The cultural expectations, the local customs, and the status of the accused all played their part. And then there were crimes of the spiritual realm. Heresy, blasphemy, or practicing unholy arts could be treated as theft not of property, but of divine order. Accusations of witchcraft in the late medieval period often involved claims of stealing fertility, livestock, or even a child's voice. These were not understood as metaphors. They were believed, feared, and prosecuted with chilling conviction. You sit quietly with these stories now. The strangeness of them settles around you like the folds of an old cloak. They remind you that crime in the Middle Ages was not merely about law-breaking, it was about identity, conformity, and the invisible threads that bound communities together. And so, as you listen to the echo of distant bells tolling midnight, you feel yourself slowly return to the broader landscape. The world of thieves is rich with contradiction, harshness, and humor, cruelty and compassion. Yet, to truly understand the thief's place in this world, there is one more road to walk, the road of redemption. Let us now explore what became of these individuals in the long shadows of their crimes, whether through punishment, repentance, or the quiet possibility of beginning again. As the long medieval night draws toward its quietest hour, we turn now to a gentler pathone that winds away from gallows and dungeons, away from jeering crowds and masked punishments. Here, we consider something rare in the chronicles of the past, but deeply human, the possibility of redemption. Not every thief ended their days with a rope around the neck or a brand upon the flesh. Some found ways through chance, compassion, or change to step beyond the shadow of their crimes and rejoin the world they once betrayed. These paths were not simple, nor were they often easy, but they did exist, and they remind us that even in the harshest of ages, there were spaces for forgiveness. In towns and villages, especially smaller ones, a thief might be taken back if their crime was seen as understandable, born of hunger, not malice. A baker whose rolls had gone missing might recognize the child who took them and choose to offer work instead of wrath. In such cases, the act of theft became a turning point rather than a final fall. The church, too, played a role in redemption. Though often a force of authority and judgment, it also offered channels for penance. A thief who confessed might be assigned a pilgrimage, a public act of contrition, or a period of service at a monastery. These penances, while difficult, could restore standing in both the eyes of the community and of God. You might imagine a man walking, staff in hand, barefoot along the road to Santiago de Compostela, his clothes threadbare, a badge of the scallop shell pinned to his cloak. Along the way he prays, begs for shelter, and offers to mend fences or carry water in exchange for bread. With each mile, the weight of his theft lessens, not forgotten, but softened by the journey. Some towns maintained a compurgation system, an ancient form of oath, clearing in which an accused thief could avoid punishment by swearing innocence and finding a set number of community members to swear on their behalf. This system, vulnerable to abuse, also allowed room for mercy. If a man or woman was well liked or believed to be truly reformed, their neighbors might speak for them, offering a shield stronger than any coin. There are records of thieves becoming watchmen, hired by towns to patrol streets they once slipped through. Who better, after all, to catch a pickpocket than one who had once lived that life? These roles were not always officially sanctioned, but they occurred, and in some cases, they restored dignity to those once deemed irredeemable. In rare but poignant cases, some thieves found new purpose within the church itself. A repentant soul might join a monastery, committing to a life of labor and prayer. Though such conversions were sometimes viewed with suspicion, there are accounts of monks and friars who admitted, later in life, to youthful crimes long abandoned. One Benedictine chronicle tells of a brother who had once been a highwayman, now tending the infirmary with quiet devotion. But not all redemption was spiritual or institutional. Sometimes it took place in the smallest, most human of ways: a mother who forgave a son, a villager who extended a second chance, a friend who chose not to report what they had seen. In these silent mercies, lives were quietly repaired. It is also important to remember that some acts of theft came not from ill will, but from blurred boundaries. A tenant who gathered herbs from the Lord's forest, a servant who kept a length of ribbon, a traveller who helped himself to a heel of cheese, left unattended, might be seen as criminal in the eyes of the law, but in the rhythms of everyday life, they were often overlooked or gently corrected rather than punished. Theft was not always a singular identity. It was a moment, a choice, sometimes a mistake, and when those who committed it were allowed to return to the hearth, the field, the stall in the market, they often became more cautious, more grateful, and more connected to the very communities that had once cast them out. You imagine now a former thief tending sheep on a hillside at dawn. His hands are weathered. His past is not erased, but it is behind him. No one speaks of it anymore, and he no longer needs to steal. The rhythm of work, of quiet days, of shared meals and festivals, has taken its place. This too was a kind of justice unwritten, unrecorded, but deeply felt. And so, in this final chapter of their journey, the medieval thief becomes not just a figure of shame or fear, but one of change. Proof that in even the most unforgiving of worlds, there were doors left slightly open, a second chance offered, a path, however narrow, back into the fold. As the candle burns low and the night grows stiller, your thoughts gather softly around this closing imaginot of crime, nor punishment, but of a life quietly rebuilt, a field at dawn, a bowl of warm broth, a hand, once trembling, now steady. And from here, we turn gently toward the end of our journey, a closing reflection on what it truly meant to live in a world where law, need, and morality intertwine so tightly, and what echoes still linger in our own.